my family took over my vacation plans for my golden sibling and her kids. But this time, I had a secret escape plan of my own. Reddit, I need some perspective on this. I need advice regarding a family dilemma that has been building up for decades, and this is a long one. Growing up in what seemed like a typical suburban American household, I, 34, have always struggled with this particular family dynamic. The golden child has always been my older sister, Emily, 41. Our home has always been a shrine to Emily's life. Every wall was covered with her achievements, and every conversation seemed to center around her. I can still vividly recall how my parents were too busy preparing for Emily's college interviews to buy a cake for my 10th birthday. They even tried to pass off her leftover graduation cake, still with her name on it, as my birthday cake. As I grew older, Emily's accomplishments seemed to overshadow every significant moment in my life. Emily got chosen for the debate team, so my parents hardly noticed when I made the honor roll in middle school. Emily had to tour college campuses, so they didn't attend the ceremony when I won a local painting contest in high school. I quickly learned that bringing up my own achievements would only prompt a quick, "That's nice, dear," before the topic would return to Emily. I learned to celebrate my successes in private, in my room. Our possessions reflected the family's priorities too. Emily always had the newest gadgets, stylish clothes, and everything she needed for her extracurricular activities, all neatly arranged in her room. In contrast, my room was full of hand-me-downs. When I expressed interest in taking music lessons, I had to make do with Emily's discarded violin, her old clothes, and old school supplies. The violin was too big for me, but I still tried to play it. "Maybe next year," my mother replied when I asked for a smaller one. All through high school, the pattern continued. I had to borrow library books for studying, while Emily received private SAT tutoring. My parents took out a loan to buy her a car for college. They told me I could take the bus. Emily's needs and desires were always at the center of every family discussion, financial decision, and holiday preparation. Things were difficult during college. With my parents' full support, Emily earned her degree at a prestigious university. When it was my turn, they agreed to pay only half of my public school tuition. "We're still paying off Emily's student loans," they explained. "You'll have to figure out the rest on your own." To make ends meet, I worked 2 part-time jobs while attending school, often falling asleep over my textbooks. Meanwhile, Emily began her career, landing a job that our parents helped her secure through their contacts. 7 years ago, Emily got married, and that's when everything took turn for the worse. For an entire year, our family's focus was on the wedding. To fund her dream wedding, which featured an expensive dress, an extravagant venue, and a guest list of more than 300 people, my parents took out another loan. Even though they were worried about the payments, I overheard them one night in the kitchen, insisting that nothing was too good for Emily's big day. Of course, I was expected to be the maid of honor. I coordinated bridal showers, planned the bachelorette party, and managed every minor emergency. "Don't be selfish, Ella," my mother told me when I expressed feeling overwhelmed with the responsibilities while working full-time. Then came the twins. Our parents were thrilled when Emily announced that she was expecting twins. Even though they were still repaying the wedding loan, they helped pay the down payment on a house near them. I watched them spend their retirement savings, the money they claimed they couldn't access when I needed help with school, on the house. But they said it was different. "This is for our grandchildren." And who became the default babysitter? Me. What began as occasional babysitting became a weekly event and then extended to evenings whenever they had appointments. My parents were in favor of this arrangement, saying, "This is what family does." Emily and her husband, Mike, assumed I would always be there to help them no matter what. Although I adore the twins, now energetic 7-year-olds, the routine is exhausting. Every weekend, Emily would drop them off at my place, usually claiming she needed me time or had important errands to run. The boys would wreak havoc, turning my small apartment into a disaster. Whenever I tried to set boundaries or ask for notice, Emily would start crying about how overwhelmed she was, and my parents would scold me for not being more supportive. Meanwhile, I worked overtime to establish myself in marketing. Recently, I was offered a promotion that would involve more hours and travel. My mother immediately remarked, "But what about the twins? Emily needs you here." Emily added, "You can't take that job, Ella. Who will help with the boys?" When I tried to bring up the promotion at a family dinner, hoping for some congratulations, I realized my time, my career, and my life meant nothing. My father chimed in, "Family comes first, Ella." My mother always added, "Emily has 2 kids to take care of. You don't know what tired really feels like." When I tried explaining how overwhelming all of this was, Emily accused me of being envious of her life. "You're just bitter because you're still single," she said, as though my marital status defined my worth. After a particularly tough weekend with the twins, I decided it was time for a break. I planned a beach vacation. I found a simple, quiet resort in Florida that was perfect for a peaceful getaway. When I mentioned it at our weekly family dinner, my mother was overjoyed. "Oh, that sounds great! We should all go together. The twins would love the beach." Before I could object, Emily had already begun planning. "You can take the boys swimming while Mike and I have some alone time," she said, as though my vacation would naturally become a time for her to offload the kids. In exchange for my help with the twins, my parents even offered to upgrade my reservation to a better resort where they'd all stay. Ignoring the fact that this was meant to be my vacation, they started planning activities around what the boys would enjoy. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I secretly booked a different resort on a secluded island. I didn't tell anyone. I started preparing, requesting time off from work, packing in secret, and ensuring my emergency funds were ready. Although I know it was dishonest, I just couldn't take it anymore. At the airport, they would be separated from me. While I boarded my flight to my destination, they would be heading to Florida. I disabled location sharing and braced myself for the inevitable fallout. Yes, I knew there would be drama. Yes, I knew they'd be upset. But for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. For 34 years, I had been the dependable sister, the perfect daughter, and the ever-ready aunt. I sacrificed my social life, my weekends, and my own needs to meet my family's demands. I had been constantly babysitting, missing out on dating opportunities, and rejecting potential relationships to always be available for them. Now, I was running away from a lifetime of being taken advantage of, not just from a holiday. I intended to use this vacation as a turning point to set clear boundaries with my family, and maybe even take a complete break from them. I was tired of always sacrificing, being the family's rock, and being the fallback. Reddit, what do you think? Am I overreacting? Should I just accept my place and follow their plans, or is it okay to want something for myself? As soon as I arrived at the resort, a wave of relief washed over me. The serene sound of the ocean, the calm breeze, and the peaceful atmosphere were exactly what I needed. No expectations, no demands, just me and my thoughts. It felt like the first time in years I could truly relax and focus on myself. I could finally breathe without the constant pressure of my family's needs. I had booked a private bungalow, far away from the crowds, where I could enjoy solitude. Every day I woke up without a schedule, without having to rush to help anyone. I took long walks along the beach, went kayaking, and even indulged in a spa day. I could finally enjoy a meal at my own pace, without being interrupted by the phone or wondering how soon I'd have to leave to pick up the kids. On the 3rd day of my trip, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Ella, where are you? We're waiting for you at the resort. The twins are asking about you." There was no question mark, just an expectation that I would be there. It stung, but at the same time, it made me realize how much of a routine it had become for me to drop everything and give in to their demands. I felt a pang of guilt. Should I have just gone along with their plans? Was I being selfish for taking this time for myself? I briefly considered returning to the family vacation, But the thought of losing my peace made me pause. It was the first time in years I didn't feel completely consumed by everyone else's priorities. The next day I received another text from my mother. "Emily is upset that you didn't show up. The boys really miss you." Again, no question or concern about why I wasn't there. The message seemed more like an accusation. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. But this time, I didn't rush to call back. I didn't immediately apologize. Instead, I sat with my feelings, knowing that I was entitled to prioritize myself for once. After everything I had done for them over the years, I had earned this moment of peace. I had never taken a vacation just for me, and I wasn't going to let guilt rob me of it. A few more days passed, and I received no further messages, no calls. It was as if they had finally accepted that I wasn't coming back. The tension in me started to ease. I realized that, for the first time in my life, I was not only physically distant from them, but emotionally distant as well. I wasn't responsible for fixing their problems anymore. I didn't have to be the one to care for the twins, take care of every little detail, or always put my needs last. It wasn't easy to accept, but I knew this was the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in years, I was learning to set boundaries. On the final day of my vacation, I sat on the porch of my bungalow, watching the sunset over the ocean. I felt a sense of clarity that had eluded me for so long. This wasn't just a break from my family. It was a break from the expectation that I would always put their needs before my own. I had to start living for myself. As I packed my bags to return home, I felt ready to face the fallout. Whatever they had to say, whatever the consequences of my actions would be, I knew that I was taking control of my life. I wasn't going to allow myself to be treated as invisible anymore. The flight home was quiet, no frantic texts or phone calls. But as I landed and checked my messages, I saw a new message from Emily. "Hope you had fun, but we need to talk when you get back." I smiled to myself. Whatever conversation lay ahead, I knew I had already made the most important decision of all. I wasn't going to let guilt or obligation dictate my life anymore. As I made my way home, a sense of calm lingered over me. The days spent at the resort had given me more than just rest. They had granted me clarity and strength. I no longer felt like I was living in the shadow of other people's needs. I could see a path forward that wasn't about sacrifice, but about balance, giving to others, yes, but also giving to myself. The moment I walked through the door, I felt an almost tangible shift in the air. There was a sense of expectation in the house, as if everything was waiting for me to resume my old role. But this time, I wasn't the same person who had left a week ago. I wasn't going to slide back into the routine of being everything to everyone. I had to protect the peace I had found, and that meant setting new boundaries, ones that wouldn't be easily ignored. Emily was the first to approach me. Her eyes were full of concern and perhaps even a hint of resentment. She didn't say anything immediately, but gave me a long look, as if trying to read my face. "Ella," she finally spoke, her tone cautious. "We need to talk about what happened. The boys, they really missed you." I could see the frustration in her eyes, but I didn't allow it to make me feel guilty. Instead, I sat down on the couch, took a deep breath, and met her gaze. "I understand," I said softly, "but I need to be honest with you. I needed this time for myself. It's been too long since I've done something just for me." I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle. "I love the boys, you know that, but I can't keep putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own." Her expression softened slightly, though there was still a flicker of frustration. "But we're family. You've always been the one to take care of us. Why now?" "Because I've been neglecting myself for too long. I've been running on empty, Emily. I was drowning in everyone else's needs, and it wasn't fair to me. Or to you, for that matter." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but closed it again. Looking away for a moment, she was processing. I could see it in the way her brows furrowed and her lips pressed together. The silence between us was heavy, but I didn't regret what I had said. This was the conversation I needed to have. Maybe I haven't been as understanding as I should have been," she admitted after a long pause. "I guess I didn't realize how much you've been sacrificing. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief that she was hearing me. This wasn't just about me taking a vacation, it was about opening up a conversation that had been long overdue. I've always tried to make things easier for everyone, I said, but I can't keep doing it at the cost of myself. If that means we need to reassess how we all share the responsibilities, then we need to do that. I'm not asking for everything to change overnight, but I can't keep being the one to hold everything together. Emily sat down beside me, her shoulders slumped in resignation. I understand, Ella, I really do. It's just hard to let go of the way things have always been. I know, but it's time for a change for both of us. The conversation didn't solve everything immediately. There would be more discussions, more adjustments to make. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to carry the entire weight of the world on my shoulders. There was a shift, a new understanding between us. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I realized how different the atmosphere felt in the house. There was less tension, less expectation. I wasn't walking around in a fog of guilt anymore. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The next day, I reached out to my therapist, scheduling our next session. I had realized that the work of healing wasn't over yet. There was more to uncover about why I had felt so responsible for everyone else's happiness. But for now, I was proud of myself. I had taken the first crucial step toward reclaiming my life. And as the days went by, I began to notice small changes. Emily was making more of an effort to handle the boys' schedules. She was beginning to ask for help, but she wasn't waiting for me to step in and fix everything. There was a sense of mutual respect that hadn't existed before, and it was slowly, steadily growing. I was learning, too. I was learning to say no without feeling guilty, to take time for myself without apologizing. It was a process, but one I was willing to embrace fully. And as I lay in bed that night, with the quiet hum of the house surrounding me, I knew that I had finally begun to live for myself again. It wasn't the end of my journey, but it was a new beginning. And that, I realized, was enough. The next few weeks felt like a delicate dance. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and I didn't expect it to be. Some days old patterns crept back in, and I found myself slipping into my old habits of putting others first. But every time that happened, I caught myself a little faster. I learned to stop, take a deep breath, and remind myself of the boundaries I was setting. Emily and I continued to talk openly about our roles in the house. She was adjusting, and although it wasn't always easy, we both recognized the importance of the changes we were making. It wasn't about blame, but about understanding. Understanding that we were both human, both capable of more than we had given ourselves credit for. The boys noticed the shift too. At first, they seemed a little confused by the changes. I had always been the one to anticipate their needs before they even asked. Now they were learning to ask for things themselves, and at times it was frustrating for them. There were moments when they expressed their dissatisfaction, but instead of stepping in immediately, I let them navigate their own problems. Sometimes they figured it out on their own. Other times they turned to Emily for guidance. It was empowering for them, and even though it took some adjusting, I knew this was better for all of us in the long run. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the house for a few hours. I had a rare moment of solitude, and I savored it. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world outside. There was a sense of peace that filled the space, and I realized how much I had missed moments like these. The stillness was no longer something I feared, no longer something I filled with the noise of constant busyness. It was during that quiet moment that I decided to give myself the space to truly reconnect with my own dreams, the ones I had set aside for so long.
Let's check it out.
I had once loved painting, but it had been years since I'd picked up a brush. So I dusted off my old art supplies and set up a small corner in the living room where I could create. I started with simple sketches, but each line felt like a part of me was being restored.
Isn't it so pretty? Okay, the design
in the evenings,
on this shirt,
when the house settled into its familiar rhythm, I began to find time to read again, another long-lost hobby. I had forgotten how much joy it brought me, how a good book could transport me to another world. The more I made space for these small joys, the more I realized that I was building a life I could be proud of, not just for others, but for myself. I shared my progress with Emily one evening over dinner. I started painting again, I told her, my voice full of excitement, and I've been reading at night, just for me. She smiled warmly. That's great, Ella. I can see how much it's helping you. I think it's good for both of us to have our own things, to not be so caught up in taking care of everyone else. I agree, I said, nodding. I think it's important for me to have my own space. I need to remember who I am outside of all the roles I play. She leaned back in her chair, thinking for a moment. I think I need to start doing the same. I've been so focused on the boys and trying to make everything perfect, I've forgotten about myself too. There was a moment of shared understanding between us. We were both learning, growing, and becoming more of who we truly were. It felt like we were forging a new kind of relationship. Not one built solely on obligation, but on mutual respect and a desire to live more authentically. The days turned into weeks, and I started noticing more subtle shifts. The boys were becoming more self-sufficient, but they were also learning to appreciate the quiet moments I took for myself. Emily and I were sharing more responsibilities, and it was no longer just about surviving the chaos of daily life. It was about thriving together, each of us carving out space for our personal growth while supporting each other. I was also seeing the transformation within myself. The guilt I once felt when I wasn't constantly available was slowly dissipating. I was beginning to understand that by taking care of my own needs, I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was enriching my relationships with everyone. I had more to give because I had started giving to myself. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized that I had found a new sense of balance. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and hesitation, but I knew I was on the right path. The peace I had once sought was no longer something I hoped for. It was something I had created. In that moment, I felt proud of myself, proud of the changes I had made, proud of the journey I had undertaken, and proud of the future I was now building. There would always be challenges, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face them. Not as the person who had to do everything for everyone, but as the person who had finally learned how to live for herself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give, not just to myself, but to everyone I loved. As the months passed, I found that the more I embraced this newfound balance, the more it began to ripple out into other aspects of my life. The relationships I had with my family, with Emily, and even with the boys deepened in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was an unspoken understanding between us all, a sense of cooperation that wasn't there before. We were no longer a collection of individuals just surviving under the same roof. We were a team, working together, each person contributing in their own way. The boys, once hesitant and uncertain in the face of changes, began to thrive in their newfound independence. There were moments of frustration, sure, but those were part of the growing pains. I watched them with pride as they took on new responsibilities, doing their chores without being asked, helping each other with homework, and finding ways to manage their time without my constant oversight. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. They were learning to manage their own lives, and I could see the confidence growing in them. Emily, too, was finding her own path. I had worried that she might feel left out of the equation or unsure about how to navigate her own space amidst the changes, but instead she flourished. She began focusing more on her personal projects, rediscovering passions and hobbies that had been sidelined for years. She started painting, something I hadn't even known she'd enjoyed. We would often sit together side by side in our quiet evenings, each of us absorbed in our own creative worlds. It was a peaceful kind of togetherness, a bond that wasn't built on the chaos of needing to do everything for each other, but on a shared sense of respect for the time we spent apart as much as together. It felt like we were all becoming the versions of ourselves we had been before the demands of life had stretched us so thin. It wasn't that we had become perfect versions of ourselves. Far from it. but there was something beautiful in the way we had begun to take responsibility for our own happiness and well-being, without depending solely on each other for validation. There was room for us to grow in ways we hadn't anticipated. And as for me, I was more present in my own life than I had been in years. I found myself waking up each morning with a sense of excitement, not about the responsibilities of the day ahead, but about the opportunity to continue carving out my own space. I continued painting, and soon I was experimenting with different styles and techniques. I joined a local art group where I met new people who encouraged me to explore my creativity even further. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, something that allowed me to grow and develop beyond the roles of wife, mother, and caretaker. The more I nurtured my own passions, the more I had to give in all the other areas of my life. When I showed up for my family, I was no longer showing up out of obligation. I was showing up because I wanted to, because I had the emotional reserves to truly be present. My relationships felt richer, deeper, and more authentic. The small moments, whether it was reading a book with my son, discussing an idea with Emily, or simply sharing a laugh over dinner, became the building blocks of a life I was proud of. One evening, after a particularly wonderful day of painting and sharing a quiet meal with the family, Emily and I sat on the porch again, watching the stars. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. She leaned back in her chair, looking up at the sky, and then turned to me. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought we'd be here like this, living in this kind of balance. It's been a process, but I'm so glad we've gotten here." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. I am too. It's funny, though. I never realized how much I was missing out on before, how much I had been losing by not taking care of myself. And now that I've made that shift, everything else seems to fall into place. It's like we've all found a better way to be together. She nodded, her eyes twinkling in the soft light. It's the best kind of growth, I think. The kind that happens not because we try so hard, but because we allow ourselves to change naturally without forcing it. We sat there for a while longer, letting the quiet wash over us. It was the kind of peace I hadn't even known I was craving, and I realized how much I had learned along the way. It was no longer about being everything for everyone. It was about being enough for myself and allowing others to be enough for themselves too. In doing that, we had created something far more powerful than any sacrifice could have built, a genuine, sustainable love and respect for each other and for ourselves. As time passed, this new sense of balance became more ingrained in our daily lives. There was no sudden shift where everything became perfect, but rather a gradual settling into a rhythm that worked for us. It was as if we had all finally found our own cadence, and in doing so, we could move through the challenges of life with a sense of grace rather than stress. The boys, who had once been caught in the whirlwind of school, extracurriculars, and everything else, seemed more relaxed. They were learning to prioritize, to understand that it was okay to say no when they felt overwhelmed, and that taking time for themselves was just as important as meeting obligations. I could see the difference in the way they approached schoolwork, their friends, and even their personal goals. They were maturing in a way I hadn't expected, taking ownership of their decisions and the consequences that came with them. Emily, too, seemed to have reached a turning point. The shift in her was subtle at first, but as we spent more time together, I began to notice it more and more. She was more present, more joyful, and more engaged in everything she did. She started joining me at art exhibits, sharing her own creative pursuits with me, and even starting to take up new hobbies of her own. It was almost like she had rediscovered herself, someone beyond the roles of mother and wife, someone who could be her own person.
Don't miss out.
I never thought I'd see the day when Emily would prioritize herself as much as she prioritized others. But there she was, carving out time to nurture her own spirit. And in doing so, she inspired the rest of us. Watching her gave me the confidence to continue forging my own path. To not just be the person I was expected to be, but to be who I was meant to be. whole and unapologetically myself. The biggest change, perhaps, was in me. I had long been the emotional anchor of the family, and while that role had been fulfilling at times, it had often come at the expense of my own happiness. But now I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. I had begun to reconnect with the things that made me happy: painting, reading, even just spending quiet time alone. I wasn't consumed by the need to make everything perfect, to control every aspect of our lives. Instead, I learned to let go, trusting that things would work out, and if they didn't, we'd figure it out together. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were still moments of tension, moments when I felt overwhelmed by responsibilities, or when life threw a curveball that made me question everything. But those moments were fewer, and I had learned how to handle them better. The key was communication and flexibility, being willing to adapt to change, to listen to one another, and to give ourselves grace when we needed it most. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room reading a book, I heard the familiar sound of laughter outside. I stood up and walked to the window to see the boys tossing a frisbee back and forth in the yard while Emily sat on the porch watching them. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one orchestrating everything. They were finding their own moments of joy, their own sense of freedom, without needing to be told what to do. I smiled to myself, feeling a deep sense of peace. I had always believed that the key to a happy family was through constant sacrifice and effort, but now I realized that the real key was balance. It was about allowing each person the space to grow, to discover their own passions, and to contribute in their own way. As evening descended and the sky turned a soft shade of orange, the family gathered around the dinner table. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but there was a warmth in the air that couldn't be measured in words. We shared stories, joked about silly things, and savored the quiet moments that came after the busyness of the day. I realized then that this was the life I had been striving for, not the picture-perfect version of family life I had once imagined, but something far richer and more authentic. It wasn't about being flawless or constantly perfecting everything. It was about being present, being real, and giving each other the freedom to just be. In that moment, surrounded by my family, I knew I was right where I was supposed to be. As the evening progressed, a serene hush seemed to settle over our home. The flickering glow from the candle on the dinner table cast gentle shadows, and the warmth from the fireplace added a sense of comfort that only home could provide. My family, each in their own way, seemed to be at peace with the world around them. Yet, as I leaned back in my chair, savoring the simple satisfaction of the moment, I felt an odd unease slowly creeping over me. I couldn't place it at first, just a nagging feeling like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. It wasn't that anything was wrong with the evening or with my family, but something felt off, as if reality itself was shifting, and I couldn't quite understand why. My eyes wandered over to Emily, who was laughing with the boys, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver run down my spine. Her face, usually so vibrant with life, seemed distant, as if a veil had descended over it. She smiled, but her eyes were unfocused, as if she were seeing something beyond the walls of our home. Before I could ask her if she was feeling all right, I was interrupted by a soft ding from my phone. I glanced at the screen and my blood ran cold. The message was simple, but its implications were enough to send a ripple of fear through me. "Meet me at the usual place. We need to talk." It was from a number I didn't recognize. I felt a flicker of dread in my chest, the kind you get when something unsettling slips into your life unexpectedly. I had no idea who the message was from, but the request to meet at the usual place sent my mind reeling. I didn't have to think long to know exactly what it meant. I excused myself from the table, trying to maintain my composure despite the surge of panic building inside me. My family didn't seem to notice. They were too immersed in their own world. As I made my way to the door, my mind raced. The usual place. It was an old cafe near the outskirts of town, a place I used to frequent many years ago, before everything changed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. The the strange sense of unease, Emily's distant look. It was all connected. The last time I had been there, I had seen someone I hadn't expected, someone who had vanished from my life years ago. It had been a chance encounter, but the meeting had left me with questions, with a sense of something unfinished, something left unsaid. I drove to the cafe in silence, the world around me blurring as I focused on the road ahead. It was late, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional streetlight flickering overhead. The further I drove, the more my sense of dread deepened. By the time I reached the cafe, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The cafe was closed, its windows dark and uninviting, but the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and dust. The tables were stacked against the walls, and the chairs were empty, save for one. At the far end of the room, sitting at a dimly lit table, was a man I thought I would never see again. It was him.